welcome to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. And we are looking today at the foundations, the precious stones that constitute John's vision of the heavenly Jerusalem that descends down from heaven to earth. And but I thought of something that I had forgotten that I think is useful to mention when we were talking earlier about in the discussion of Christ is Alpha and Omega. And I made extensive comments on the idea that in the Hebrew alphabet, you have Aleph and Tav. Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That's changed when John is writing to a Hellenistic audience. But the Tav is significant too. And so I went into that discussion. And I neglected to mention a particular use of that I think is interesting. So I just wanted to recap that briefly. I made the comment that the Tav in its modern form is not the way that it was written originally. The proto-Sinaitic, the older form of the Hebrew letter, was like our plus sign. It was a cross. And that's the way that it would have been known from Moses way past David, really up into the exilic period. And so the cross, now sometimes the cross was laid on its side and became like our X. The Phoenicians, who are, it's accredited, the alphabet is typically accredited the Phoenicians. They had the last letter, the last letter of the Phoenician alphabet was this X form that was like the Tav on its side. But to the Hebrews, it was like a plus sign. It was like an emblem of a cross. And I made the comment that it's very interesting that when David is feigning madness, he scribbles crosses on the gate, outside of the gate of the city of Gath, which is where he's making an appeal for asylum. And is that some reflection? There will certainly be the shadows of Golgotha outside the gate of Jerusalem, which is one of the, Gath is one of the precursors of Jerusalem, as we've described it. All the chaos cities culminate in Jerusalem that rejects Messiah and crucifies Christ. He explicitly identifies it with Sodom and Egypt, we've talked about. And also the Lord said that the Ninevites, who were exceedingly wicked in the days of Jonah, would condemn the generation of Jerusalem, along with the Queen of Sheba, the Queen of the South, who came to admire Solomon's wisdom. So Jerusalem is put in a very bad light there. But I made the comment that the X is used, or the cross sign is used as a mark. And there's a very interesting use of that verb, tavah, in Hebrew, in Job 31. This section is fantastic. When I was a boy, I had the privilege of going to Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, and they had rabbis that would teach, typically they would teach the Old Testament. I did take a class in Matthew. It was interesting. They did look at what they would understand to be apocryphal writings. But in any case, I remember that I went through the book of Job with this rabbi. It was absolutely a brilliant exposition, I thought. I think there's a lot of commonality. The main theme is, of course, suffering, and so that touches all of us. But in chapters 29 to 31, you have Job's summation of his defense after all of his friends, so-called friends, have condemned him. You know, he's suffered greatly because therefore he must have sinned greatly, is the logic there, the simple logic. And he insists on his innocence in a beautiful section from 29 to 31. He examines every department of his life to see if there is anything that could be charged against him, and he maintains his innocence, and he cries out, "Oh, that there was a mediator between God and man," which of course is the role that Christ will take himself. But anyway, the conclusion of that is basically he makes an affidavit. He signs it and witnesses. He says in chapter 31, verse 35, "Oh, that I had one to hear me." That's his longing for a mediator. "Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary." And so this is his final summation. He's attesting it with his own signature. But the verb that's used here is tavah. It's the one that we have, and so that means that he is making a mark. And the mark of his signature is very likely an X or a plus sign, depending upon how he signed it. That was typically done in the world all over. The mark was made. If someone was illiterate, they made a mark. That is a question. Job seems to be anything but illiterate. But if he is, then that would be the mark that he's making to witness to a signature. That was done in America up through the development of public education and the increase in literacy in this country. So people would attest their signature with an X. So I think that's a fascinating discussion. It has no bearing. The real question in Job that no one can answer with certainty is it an old book, an ancient book? Some thought it was the first book of the Bible. I think that's highly unlikely. But in any case, and others would argue that it was late, even exilic, or more likely they would say it was Solomonic, as a wisdom book. The problem there is that it uses the word Satan, and the Satan is a late Hebrew word. So it seems to, and he is aware of the Adonai name of the Lord, so it seems like it's indistinct in time and space. We don't know where Uz was, where he lived. We have no idea. It's mentioned in Deuteronomy, but we don't know. We have no idea who Job is. He's certainly not Jewish, and he's not part of the church. He's one of these people that is outside of everything that we know. Yet he has a very clear understanding of God, and God notices him and commends him, his behavior, and actually speaks with him. So how do we fit this? It seems to me that if it's an unknown time and an unknown place, that's probably what is intended. And the reason for that is that suffering is a universal problem. And so this book that more deeply and profoundly and philosophically addresses the problem of suffering than any other book in the Bible, not being made distinctive to any particular ethnic people. It has some value, some literary value and utility. But the reason I mention it is he's drawing this cross, and I think that's interesting. It helps us to imagine why it is that the texts are usually translated David was scribbling on the wall, the gate of Gath, but it's very definitive. He's in a world that was much more aware of glyphs as being significant, and the pictures and the images, that has some utility, I think. So why is David in his feigned madness drawing images of the cross outside of the gate? Not sure we can be definitive on any of that, but I think it's interesting, and I just wanted to make that note. I'd forgotten that particular text. Okay, in Revelation 21, we have come to the vision of the heavenly city that's coming down from God to the earth in chapter 21. And we'll pick up the discussion. We'd come to the part where it's talking about the jewels that constitute the foundation of the city. And so, to pick up the context again, beginning in verse 9, then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. This ultimately relates, I think, to Psalm 48, with Jerusalem being identified with the high mountain and the mountain of the north, the axis of the world being from the Polaris star to the Jerusalem city, which is surrounded by mountains, but is timeless. So that's speaking clearly, because it's identified with the northern mountain, that's clearly speaking of the heavenly Jerusalem. And so with John, the Jerusalem that is heavenly to the psalmist in 48, chapter 48, or Psalm 48, comes down from heaven to the earth, this holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, which contrasts it with Babylon, which is the manufacture of man that is built up to heaven in the Titanic pride. The Babel builders say, let us build a tower that will pierce the heavens. And then God, Moses writes it as a taunt. God is looking down almost like a Mr. Magoo. He said, what is this that men are up to? Of course, he's omniscient. He knows everything. But he said, let us go down to see what man is up to. So it's not certainly threatening the ramparts of heaven. It's the language of the taunt, I think, is a literary figure there. So, but it's coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Hebrews calls it the city whose architect and builder is God. And so that's the city of which we all dream, the city wherein righteousness and only righteousness dwells. And so he's going to introduce us to that city, and we're going to be able to consider it and fulfill what the psalmist in Psalm 48 suggested, that we should walk around Zion and consider it, its towers, its ramparts, its walls, its palaces, all of that. So John is going to enable us to do that with more revelation. So it had the glory of God. Its radiance was like a rare jewel, like a jasper. And I talked about that. I mentioned Flinders Petrie thought that this was was identified with the odom, was identified with something more like a ruby or a carnelian. There is a red jasper stone, but we're not really sure what it was. If it's the odom, he's getting that because odom is related to the root Adam in Hebrew, which means red. And so, but I'm not sure that correspondence works exactly, but we'll talk about that. And he says it was clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates were 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. And we talked about that specifically. The summation, the top of the step pyramid, is the way it should be understood, of 12 foundations, all of which are bedecked with precious stones or jewels. On the top of it is the city itself that is bounded by these 12 gates, 3 to a side, 4 sides. And they bear the names of the sons of Jacob, of Israel. And so we talked about that a little bit more elaborately last time. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. So it's quadrilateral, and it's oriented to the points of the compass. And that's significant. The camp of Israel was too. We talked about that. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So this is an advance. We're going to be discussing these precious stones, but they're jewels. And it's typically related to the breastplate of the high priest in Israel, who had 12 stones on his breast that he carried. It was closest to his heart. But those 12 stones represented not the 12 the apostles of the nations. They didn't represent the nations. They represented the tribes of Israel. And so, though there is a connection, there is also significant differences, and the differences are, I think, significant in terms of the gospel. The high priest prayed for the tribes of Israel. The sacrifices that the Aaronic priest offered were sacrifices for the people Israel. It was exclusivistic in that sense. But when we come to John's description of the New Jerusalem, we see that the 12 precious stones are really more related to the nations. And that's pretty remarkable. We'll see how he does that when we consider their individual names. But that's a shift. And why is that shift significant? It's because it's now the age of the gospel mandate, and Christ's scepter, the scepter of David, was promised, that God promised the house of David that they would have dominion over all the earth. That's Psalm 2. Ask of me, the Lord says, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance. And so that which is upon the breastplate that is most close to the heart of Christ are the nations, not despising his love for the true Israel, the Israel of God, but there is a broadening of what the Aaronic priesthood had into something that is more Melchizedekian. Christ's priesthood is not Aaronic. You can't combine in the Old Testament the Aaronic priesthood and the royal tribe of Judah. That a king cannot exercise priestly authority. But Christ does. He is from the tribe of Judah, so he is from the royal tribe descended from David, but he is also a priest, but of a different order, a higher order. And that reminds us of, it's described, it's called actually the Melchizedek, after the order of Melchizedek. David anticipated that his descendant would have that order of priesthood in Psalm 110. Now, Melchizedek is interesting because he comes to meet Abraham after his overcoming the war with the nations, the First World War, as far as we can tell. And he greets him in Jerusalem as the king of Salem, which is probably, and he meets him in the Jerusalem area, but I think Melchizedek is clearly the Lord Christ. His priesthood is eternal, so he had it even in his incarnation. He was Melchizedekian. But, and he was of the Judahite tribe, the royal tribe as well. But it's a different order of priesthood. And so he meets Abraham, of course, with the bread and the wine, which are the tokens of Christ's covenant. We're told he had no genealogy. I think that's very literal. He had no beginning or ending. That means he is the eternal Christ. And I think that Hebrews is arguing for his divinity. I don't know why that's even closely contested. There could not have been a succession of kings. Melchizedek is a unique name and a unique king. He's the king of righteousness, and he serves God Most High, El Elyon. The highest God is more universal. And so he celebrates Abraham and encourages him after his victory over the nations, by which they all learned about the God of Abraham. I think the idea we have is that the gospel wasn't preached except through this small community and his confederates, the servants of Abraham, that went with him into the battle, but they were all called covenanters. They were all covenant. They all received the sign of circumcision. And not all of them were household slaves. They were allies to Abraham. And so from the very early on, we're disabused of the idea that there has to be genetic continuity to Abraham in order to participate in the covenant of Abraham. And so Melchizedek, who represents El Elyon, the highest God, who is the creator of the heavens and the earth, that is, he has a universal scope of the Lord's dominion and mind, and he blesses Abraham. It's through Abraham, the covenant of Abraham, that all the nations would find blessing, and so he's anticipating all of that. And so what John does, I think very cleverly, is rewrite the breastplate to show that. And so the precious stones now are going to be representative of the apostles to the nations, and not the priests of the Aaronic priests of Israel. The Aaronic priesthood comes to an end very clearly in the Bible. It's one of the bookends that are used literarily to show the significance and centrality of the cross. Prior to the cross, and there are many of these, but anyway, prior to the cross, when the high priest, the Aaronic high priest of Israel, accuses Jesus of blasphemy, which you have to imagine the magnitude of that crime. He is charging God with sin against God. When he does that, he says, when he has adjured Christ, and then Christ has said who he is, he says to the Sanhedrin, "You've heard the blasphemy." And so he's charging God with blasphemy. And he tears his robe, and I take it that had been a typical gesture of distress, but I take it that in that case he is really divesting himself, and all subsequent priests that follow in that denial of Christ. They are divested of their Aaronic priesthood. And God puts an end to it on the other side of the cross when Christ dies at their hand, in the hand of the Romans as well, but largely at the hand of the instigation of the high priests, who instigated the Romans because they wanted him hanged upon a tree. In order to invoke the curse, you can't have a cursed Messiah, they would have thought. But anyway, when Christ dies, God himself tears the veil in two from top to bottom, so it can be known that this was done of heaven, and exposes the Holy of Holies in the temple, and that anticipates the destruction of the temple with no prophecy that gives divine sanction to its being rebuilt. And so that's the end of the Aaronic priesthood. It continued out of custom, but its divine sanction was gone because Christ said, "Destroy this temple," speaking of his body, "and on the third day I will raise it up." So the resurrection is the only legitimate raising of the third temple, the eschatological temple in Israel. He is the cornerstone, the one the builders rejected as the headstone. He was raised up as the cornerstone, and he is building. His vision now is universal. It will go to all the nations, as we'll talk about. It's going to be dematerialized from Jerusalem, and it's going to become universal in its scope, and that's how John will indicate it as well. So I think that's significant that the precious stones represent the nations. That's not to denigrate the promises God made to the Israel of God, the believing Israel, as Paul would call it, did in Galatians, "Peace be upon the Israel of God." Godly Israel was following in the faith of Abraham, and they have their own blessing, and that's the gates of the city, which we'll see. It's marvelous the way that this is woven together, and the emblems and the way that the images are utilized here. So he said, "The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And the one who had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and the gates and the walls, and the city lies 4 in length, the same as width, and he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia." Now we need to talk to this. I want to look at it in its original context. I think there are some comments here that need to come from the Greek itself when we get to these precious stones. So let's turn over to 21, and let's see. The foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every jewel. The first was jaspis, or jasper is how it's been identified. These stones are very hard to catalog. They're not scientific names. They're often named for the places where they're found, as we will see. But, and they were not all known to everyone. Pliny, in his natural history, talks about sardonyx and chalcedony, along with some others. So he gives us a location of some of these, so we have some idea. But they weren't scientific names, and they didn't really distinguish between precious and semi-precious as we do. They were all precious to them. In their polished state, they weren't faceted, but they were polished, and they would be quite beautiful in the way that they would transmit light and show its prism of colors. So he says here, the first one is jasper, and I've talked about that. If it is jasper, it could be the green jasper, but jasper comes predominantly in red, and brown and yellow. So we're just not really sure, but it's certainly a very multicolored. It can occur in an agated form. It can have multicolors and bandings and stripes and all. So it says the first foundation is this jaspis jasper. The second is sapphire. And the sapphire has been identified with lapis lazuli. And the lapis in the ancient world, it's for its bluish color. The sapphire that we know, the blue sapphire, was very rare and not mentioned until the 2nd century AD, I believe, in anything that we can recognize. The commonality is blue, and the sapphire is pretty generally accepted to be the lapis lazuli, which comes from Afghanistan. And we'll notice that these foundations that represent the apostles to the nations come from remote regions, many of them. So that fits the metaphor beautifully. It is a composite city. It's an ecumenical city. And the nations here are represented under the figure of stones that are identified as the source of some of these, the topaz of Ethiopia. Job celebrated in the hymn to wisdom. In Job 28, he celebrates the topaz of Ethiopia that's not worthy to be counted or measured against the value of wisdom. So the topaz of Ethiopia, it was also that was known for its gold. But and Isaiah used the figure of animals. He said the dromedaries, the camels will come, the wild goats will come. He used all these figures of all of these different nations that have distinct animals. And then they used the figure of trees as well. The temple, the tabernacle and the temple were built with wood from all over. The temple especially. There was the olive wood, of course. There was the almond wood, the almug. There was the sandalwood. Sandalwood comes from India. So all of these, and ebony from Africa. It's a fabulous metaphor of an ecumenical house that's representing all the earth. So, but the sapphire is lapis lazuli, so that's going to bring in something as remote as the northern part of the Himalayas. And the third was chalcedony. This one we can locate pretty confidently because Pliny wrote about this and identified it with the city of Chalcedon in northern Turkey. I guess we call it Turkey now, or they want us to call it Turkey. Chalcedon is a town not far from Constantinople in that realm, in that region of Turkey. And it is famous for, of course, in Christian theology and the development of doctrine, it's famous for the Council of Chalcedon, which finally determined the nature of Christ as being fully God, fully man, united together forever in one person. So it defined the natures of Christ in an orthodox sense, and that has remained true. Whether you're Eastern, Roman, or Protestant, the nature of Christ has been defined, the Orthodox vision of Christ. But that this particular stone is identified with the region of Turkey. All of these are outside of Israel itself, Israel proper. The fourth is the emerald, and that would be known because of, that would be found in far regions. It's found today in Colombia. It's found in Thailand and Burma, and it's famous in India. It's famous in some parts and regions of Africa. So a beautiful stone. I remember seeing, when I was a boy, I saw a Peruvian Incan crown, and it was all gold and teardropped emeralds. It was just absolutely magnificent. The fifth is sardonyx, and that too is identified by Pliny as a region, Sardin. So again, that same idea is coming across. The sixth is sardius. Sardis is well known, again in the Turkey area. The seventh is chrysolithos, and chrysos means gold. This literally means gold stone. Well, what that is, we really don't know. It could have flakes of gold in it. It could be golden, including some kind of matrix with gold itself. We really don't know. The eighth is beryl. That's well known, but there are all kinds of beryl. There's the watermelon beryl that has green on the outside and red on the inside in a cylindrical kind of crystalline structure. So that's how it derives its modern name. But the beryl can be red, it can be green, it can be white, it can have any number of colors. The ninth stone is the topaz, and I think this one, to someone who would know the Bible, this is very clearly connected with Ethiopia in the Bible. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot be valued with wisdom. That's Job's hymn to wisdom, chapter 28. The 10th is the chrysoprasus, and again we have this root of gold in it, whatever that is. We just really don't know. We can't be that specific. I wish we could, but we can't, at least at this point. The 11th is the hyacinth, and that is probably named for the flower, which is kind of a bluebell. And so it's thought that that's giving its very dramatic violet blue color to this particular stone. So the 12th is the amethyst, and that's found virtually everywhere. In Brazil, there are these beautiful amethyst cathedrals. I have 2 of those in our kitchen, opposing each other. But many of you will know it's a very nondescript outside, but inside it's filled with these deep purple, very rich-looking crystals. It looks like diamonds. So it reminds me of the verse that we ourselves are heavenly treasure in earthen vessels. So these have been admired and have served beautifully for ages now. The amethyst, that's found, it's a kind of quartz, and so it's very common, found all over the world. And their 12 gates were 12 pearls, respecting each one of the gates. Each one was made of 1 pearl. Now this is significant. To understand the stones are beautiful, but their light, it takes the light to bring forth their luster and their brilliance. Apart from the light, they are just dark stones, all of them. And so there's nothing to say there, but Christ dwells within the city, which illumines the whole foundations of the city. So it's a magnificent statement of the beauty that the people of God will have when Christ is in their midst, and they will show forth the variety in these variegated stones, the variety of the imagination of God, who can make this band of visible light. And I've wondered, because the visible light is such a narrow part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's clearly that this is a supernatural city. And I wonder if we'll have eyes that will be able to see a larger band than just the visible light to us, which has these magnificent colors, going back to 3 primary colors, but the variety that comes from their mixture and admixture is fantastic. The palette that God has created from those 7 colors that are refracted, according to Newton, 7 colors from the light of the sun that we see in the rainbow, and then we see in these precious jewels. Is what he's writing about, what John writes about when he gives us a vision of heaven in chapters 4, 5, and then 21 and 22, is a sound and light show. It's very much like Dante uses when he describes Paradiso, the 3rd part of his triptych, which is his cosmological vision. He writes about paradise, and it's a sound and light show. So here we have the same idea, the same context. The city itself is on top. It surmounts this mountain of precious jewels, and it has 12 gates. And of course, those are going to be familiar to everyone in the ancient world. It has 12 gates, and each gate, we're told, is made of pearl. Now, pearl was highly prized in the ancient world. Remember, the Lord spoke of the pearl of great price, that the merchant would sell everything he had in order to purchase. He realized the pearl, the value of it. It was identified with the bride who would wear a string of pearls. This is the bridal city, and the 12 gates are like a string of pearls that surround the city. But the pearl, I think, has another significance because it is not a mineral, technically. It's organic. And the pearl, the beautiful pearl, comes to us because of the kindness of God toward a little animal in the sea that nobody would pay any attention to. It's the oyster that has a very tender membranous skin and lives in the shell, the clam shell. And but when it's opened, sometimes a grain of sand or a sharp piece of shell can make its way into the shell, the oyster shell, which is the home of the oyster. And that sharp sand can irritate the skin of the oyster. But God has given the little oyster a wisdom by which he can secrete this substance, organic substance called necrete. And from that, he surrounds the offending particle and makes this beautiful spherical, multicolored, because you can see the rainbow colors in it, this beautiful pearl that was very, very much valued. It was rare. You had to find the right oyster, and they didn't have artificial cultivation in those days, and so they would all be natural. And occasionally they would open up an oyster and it would have a pearl in it, and so those were highly valued and often adorned the necks of brides. And so here is this gates of pearl. But I think the significance of them is the gates are of one pearl. The point of that is that when you enter into these gates, that means that all suffering has been left behind. God in kindness enables the oyster to make this spherical pearl, which doesn't have a side that can irritate its sensitive skin. So the sharpness is hidden away and forgotten, and the artifact that's left is this magnificently beautiful pearl. I think that's the significance of the gates of pearl. It's not so much a figure of its beauty, although that's there. We don't exhaust these figures of speech, really. But it speaks to those who have suffered and have now entered into the city where suffering is a memory and has left a memorial of the goodness of God to us, we as little creatures. He has remembered his promises to us and his salvation. And it's a magnificent thought, really, that you find all over the New Testament. Paul, who had seen heaven, along with John, said that when he measured the sufferings of this world, and he suffered exceptionally and strongly, as we know from his self-testimony in 2 Corinthians, he suffered all kinds of horrible injuries and tortures. But he made the comment, the sufferings of this world are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will come. And the comfort is that when we pass through those gates of pearl, we will have left all suffering behind. So there's much here. The value, the price, you'd sell all that you would have. It's an inducement to come to the wedding, which is the open invitation of the gospel, all the way through. Anyone who has a sense of sin and who cries out to the Lord for mercy in the day of judgment will find it. The gospel invitation is open to everyone, and so these are inducements. Paul is doing the work of the evangelist. He's encouraging people to come. Who doesn't want to enter that city? Who doesn't want to pass through those gates of pearl to the place where the sufferings of the present age are not worthy to be compared with the glory that God will reveal? And so, anyway, and the street of the city was gold, pure gold, and transparent as glass. Now, we don't understand that. We don't understand the chemistry of it, the mechanics of it. how is gold, pure gold, is beautiful and valuable, and so we can see those inducements, but we don't understand it as being clear like glass. It seems like he's describing something here. It's clear like glass. It's metaphoric. He's not saying it's glass, he's saying it's like glass. So maybe that which is material has some kind of new form. It's interesting in the periodic tables, you generally move from left to right. You move from the gases to the solids, to the metalloids, and then to the metals. And so there is some transition there. Maybe that anticipates something of what we're talking about. Gold typically finds itself among the solids in the middle. But it could mean that that's an aspect of the heavenly city that we've yet to experience or understand, and so it has to be communicated metaphorically. And he says, I saw a shrine. I saw no shrine. The shrine word is the word for temple. The temple complex itself, I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God, the Almighty, is its temple. What a marvelous and beautiful view of the heavenly city. Its ecumenicity. Christ said, if you lift me up, I'll draw them into myself. And I think that we see that. He's being lifted up, and his source is heaven coming to earth. But all the nations are invited, like Isaiah the prophet foretold, that they would all flow up to the mountain and be constituent. We would be living stones. As Christ is the foundation, we would be the living stones, fitted together, as Paul talks about in Ephesians. Magnificent temple spanning all of heaven and all of earth. It's clearly a cosmic enterprise. The Lord Jesus is building a temple, unlike the Temple of Solomon. Solomon lamented that his house, which was magnificent in its day, he said this little house could not contain the immensity of God. He had wisdom enough to recognize that. But Jesus comes not with imparted wisdom, but Jesus came as the wisdom of God. In the philosophy, you say someone partakes of wisdom, but Jesus did not partake of wisdom. Solomon did. But Jesus is the wisdom of God, and so he is competent to build a house that can contain the immensity of God, and he has done so in this heavenly city that he is building, that is filling all of heaven and all of earth, and among whom God will dwell. It's a magnificent vision. Thank you for listening. Please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel if this has been useful to you or intriguing. To learn more, you can visit my webpage, drwarrengage.com, or find me on my Patreon account, patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. I hope you'll join me next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. Thank you.